Next comes your formative evaluation and revision section, and here you will include the evaluation design and the findings and interpretation. So for your questions and instrument summary, what we want to see is a table that includes the criterion, and this criteria here comes from the textbook. These are the recommended criteria for one-to-one evaluations. Then for the questions, you will include the evaluation questions per criterion. And then finally, the instrument section, you basically just list the instrument that you will use to collect the data to answer the questions for each criterion. In terms of questions, you're going to have plenty of ideas of what to focus on for each of these criterion. On page 285, the book starts discussing questions that you can focus on when you're designing your formative evaluation. But specifically on page 286 at the top, the last three items are particularly applicable to collecting data from learners when it comes to clarity, impact, and feasibility. Also on page 288, more specifically talking about one-to-one evaluation with learners, you'll see that there's three more questions that you can focus on here. And then on page 90, these questions that appear here towards the bottom are specifically about feasibility. Last but not least, when you're reading about the sequence for examining data, you have some questions embedded here that can also be useful for your evaluation questions. And so when it comes to the instruments, you basically just want to say whether you're going to use observation checklists, forms that you will use during the observation of your learners, whether you're going to include pre and post tests, whether you're going to include surveys for the attitudes of students toward the learning experience, or whether you will interview students using an interview schedule. The next part of this is to talk about your learners and specifically how you went about selecting them. So on page 288, the discussion about selecting learners starts, and it gives you some ideas of the criteria that you can use, and then it continues on page 289. Finally, there's a section on data collection. And on this section, you will describe in detail the instruments that you said you were going to use in your questions and instrument summary. So for each one of those instruments that you listed, you will provide the name of the instrument, the type of instrument, the sections if you are going to divide your document into part 1, part 2, and so on. That is only if applicable. The number of questions or items per section or in the entire instrument, the types of questions or items that you will include, how it was administered. Did you give it to them in a paper and pencil test, or was it available online, or is this something that you sat next to the learner while they were doing something, or is it orally they discussed, they requested or did whatever. And so when it was administered, was it before the instruction, during the instruction, after, during what segment? If you use an observation form, maybe you want to list something like a behavior that you will focus on out of anything that can happen during the time when the learners are using your instruction. You're going to focus on specific things, specific behaviors, specific situations, whatever word you want to use here to describe the items you want to focus on, whether they happened or not. And this is not necessary, this is just ideas on what to put on that form, and your notes on what happened for each particular area. But this is just a guideline for you when you sit and look at somebody going through your documents. It's better if you plan ahead and think of the important things that you need to consider, so that when that's happening you can quickly jot down some notes. Otherwise, if you show up with just a blank page, you may miss important things to consider. If you decide you're going to interview your learners to inquire about anything in particular, then you would include an instrument that consists of just your list of questions. And then if you use a survey, which you may use for your attitudes, for the impact on attitudes criterion, then you have plenty of ideas on the types of questions that you can ask your students. So for example, on page 294, you have a series of questions there about attitudes. On page 307, you have a form that you can use. It's there towards the bottom of the page. And then on pages 309 and 310, there is an actual survey. Now, you're not going to have this comprehensive a survey because you're evaluating with fewer students, but these have suggestions on the types of questions you may want to ask. Of course, include the actual instruments in the appendix. The procedures section of your evaluation design basically just requires that you list the steps that you will go through to administer your evaluation design, or rather the steps that you went through when you conducted your evaluation. They don't have to be in a graphic format, just a list of steps that include, what you did first, what instrument you administered when, and then what happened and all of that. And so page 290 starts the discussion of the procedure. So it gives you ideas on how to approach this section.